my name is Michelle Hammond. There's some familiar faces in here, which is always nice. Those of you who don't know me, I am currently the Student Voice Coordinator in Washoe County School District. So I spend all of my days doing student voice in all 100 plus of our schools. And before that, I've always done pretty extensive work around trauma impacted students. I got my teaching degree, did my student teaching, and I decided that I just wanted to do something that was a much more global impact, specifically with populations of students who are affected with trauma. And so I've had such a blessing in our school district to run various programs, one of which I use a lot of stories from throughout this presentation. For about 8 years, I had the honor of working in some of our local high schools to establish programs for teen parents and their infant babies and toddlers. So a lot of my experiences with trauma impacted students and student voice come from that. I'm also here today presenting with my colleague Jennifer Harris, who some of you may know.
Hi there, welcome.
And Jennifer Harris is a program evaluator for our district and has done amazing work around student voice and making sure that when we're out there in our schools evaluating our work, that student voice is front and center. She started a lot of our original student voice work or was a part of that in 2014 when this work really became prevalent in Washoe County. So that's who we are, and we're excited to be here with you tonight. So just to give you an idea of what we are going to be doing together in this very short hour and 15 minutes, let me pull up the agenda. So what we're going to do tonight is basically break down student voice into what it is. For some of you, this might be review. So if you've been to some of my trainings, you've heard this before, but we're going to review what it is, why it's so critical in creating trauma-sensitive classroom and school environments for our kiddos, and then the most important piece, like really how to elevate that student voice throughout your school and classroom setting. We're hoping that by the time you leave, you know some new strategies for both soliciting student voice and also responding to those stories of trauma that they may share with you. And we hope that you leave feeling all sorts of things, but inspired, confident, curious, and empathetic are among some of those top ones that we're hoping for tonight. So we're going to revisit these at the end and check in with you to see how we did. So again, it's a very ambitious agenda. Just as a disclaimer, it moves very quickly. There's a lot of information that we felt was important. And the way we look at this is kind of like a sampling of student voice activities or student voice supports that are available to you in our school district. So if there's anything in here where you're just like, man, I really wanted to dive deeper into that, please reach out to us through email. And we can come in and work with you, even if that's one-on-one coaching with a teacher, if it's school site trainings. We offer so many things around all of these topics. So it's going to feel very quick and rushed. But again, it's not an end all. So we hope that this just gets you thinking deeper into how you might apply some of this. So to get you started, we want you to be able to engage in some of this. And so recently we held a series of town halls. The town halls were very student-centered, so the students chose the topics that were important to them, during this really difficult time. And then basically the students held these town halls where they, co-planned and co-presented these sessions where they got into breakout rooms and they really talked to kids about what it is kids are needing right now. So from that, we asked the students to summarize the things that they found. And we're hearing from students, and here are 4 hashtags among many, many, many that we heard from students as far as summarizing student findings. And so what we wanted you to do is in the chat box, if you could pick one of these hashtags that elicits some kind of emotional response from you and why. And so again, open the chat box. Which one of these elicits some emotional response from you and why? So I know for me, the Hear Our Story and Hear What We Feel, this one really hit home to me because as we know, our kiddos at the secondary level have been out of schools full time for over a year now. So, they're going either virtually all the time or they're going every other day. And so those opportunities for them to really share their stories with us as professionals and educators, it's even fewer that they get those opportunities, and they're really begging to have us hear their stories. Awesome. So I see a lot of people liking "We are in this together." Other people like the quote about "Hear our stories and hear how we feel." Better connections. Awesome. So keep those going. But I always love to hear educators respond to what students are sharing with us. So moving along in our agenda, what is student voice? So oftentimes when I go into schools and do trainings about student voice, I'll ask teachers in the room, on an average day, we spend 180 school days with kids, 6+ hours a day. So on an average school day as a teacher, or as a counselor, sometimes principal, like what percentage of that time is spent listening to students? And oftentimes, usually we're in the classroom physically, so I can really hear their response a little bit more. And so what I get a lot of the times is some chuckles and some laughter. And then usually they throw out really high numbers, 80% plus. And we'll hear stories about how, even when they're trying to like rush down the hallway for that like quick 2-minute bathroom break that you get in your day, students are catching you in the hallway and they're telling you about their days or they're sharing stories with you. When you're trying to sit down for a 5-minute lunch break to check district emails, you scarf down that lunch. Students are coming into your classroom and they're wanting to talk to you. And so we're constantly listening to students. But when we talk about our working definition in our school district of student voice, we're really talking about taking all of those haphazard, like really chaotic moments that you're interacting with students and really turning them into a practice where we are intentionally, purposefully, and very systematically eliciting that student voice for improvement purposes. So we're always wanting to improve everything we do on a daily basis as teachers. We're constantly thinking, how can we better serve these kids? So the 5 elements that we usually look for in true student voice are that the topics we're engaging students in are relevant to them, that there's constant opportunity to have ongoing discussions between students and adults, that students are involved in planning and decision making, that there's actually shared power between students and adults, and then last, that students are actually involved in the actions that it takes to address our school improvement or classroom improvement efforts. I know on Monday, our keynote speaker talked about collective efficacy and really including all of our stakeholders. And so this really hit home to me because our biggest stakeholders are the students that we serve. So the more we can include them in that, the better. And so obviously when I ask how many of you are doing this, it's a much different response that I get from the audience, which is fine. So I also love continuums because continuums are very strengths based and it allows us to think about what we're already doing and how we might move a step ahead. And so one of the things I like to do with teachers talking about classroom settings is use this continuum to kind of show how oftentimes as teachers, and I've seen very good examples of student voice activities in classrooms where we are all the way up to a leadership level. So that right side of really deep student voice. However, if we did that all the time, we'd be really burned out and we probably wouldn't be doing anything super effectively, right? And so in the classroom, oftentimes when we're building this culture of student voice, we're really looking at this expression and consultation. So these levels of over on the left, so they're still really good examples of how we can use students as our data sources and really gather their perspectives. And so the more we can allow them to express themselves, and then in return, we're consulting with them constantly and vice versa. So the more we consult with them, the more they'll feel comfortable expressing themselves. Again, this is super important with students affected by trauma because the more we do this feedback loop, the more safe they feel to share those stories of trauma. And the more we as teachers are going to constantly create those opportunities to learn about those stories of trauma, as well as how those stories are impacting student learning. So we wanted to go ahead and let you guys have a moment to think about student voice and what you are already doing. So think about ways you listen to kids, whether it's those haphazard opportunities that you take to listen to kids, or maybe you're already doing some student voice strategies. So what are some ways you listen to students currently, and where do those practices fall on the student voice continuum? So now that you kind of know, what student voice is and a little bit about how, it can benefit students affected by trauma, I really want to talk for a minute about why student voice for our students impacted by that trauma. So I know the other night on Monday, we heard a lot of really interesting things from our keynote. And if you've had a chance to look through the book, there's so many connections here between student voice and our kiddos who experience trauma in their lives. One of the things that really stood out for me is that students really kind of have these adaptations that they make so that they can function in the context of their trauma. And so they'll oftentimes bring that to the school setting. And so we heard and we read in the book about a lot of examples about how behaviors oftentimes are, just manifestations of the trauma the students are experiencing. And so if we are not setting up our classrooms in a way that really get into identifying those students and hearing their stories of trauma so that we know what they're going through and how it's affecting them, oftentimes what we see is we just keep getting stuck in these cycles, right? So we're constantly trying to solve these problems and increase student achievement. And oftentimes we'll, hear teachers say, I just feel like I'm not getting anywhere with this student. And sometimes that's why. And so we're trying to treat the behavior without knowing the real data behind that behavior. So it's super important with these kiddos that we figure out what's going on. The town halls that I recently talked about, we heard some really interesting things from students as far as things that they're currently dealing with. And so a couple of these really hit home and were applicable to this conversation today. And so one of the things we heard across the board from students was that they want more opportunities to connect. So they're really wanting to talk to teachers. They're really wanting to connect with teachers. But they're also really feeling like that's difficult, not just during COVID and through distance learning, but even when our environments are in person 100% of the time, they really struggle to know how to reach out for help and how to reach out for support. And so one of the things I always think of with our trauma impacted kiddos, and I can't tell you how much I saw this in my own role working with these kiddos who have so much coming into us from their home lives during the day. But the kids who need the love and the support the most, they're not always the kids who know how to ask for it in the appropriate ways, right? And we've all seen this before. So it's a good reminder, even with these town halls that we held, it was a good reminder for us because we've quickly realized that the students who were coming to the table to share perspectives with us through these town halls, they were there willingly sharing their perspective, but we were missing a lot of students. And a lot of the students we felt like we were missing were those students who were maybe very trauma impacted and they don't always sign up for these opportunities that we provide them through leadership and through various activities. So again, it's super important that we are embedding student voice practices into our classroom routines, into our tier 1 strategies, so that we're constantly soliciting that voice and those stories from them. Another quote that really stood out to us, a student said, I would say that persistent teachers create persistent students. If teachers are reaching out and trying to make sure like, hey, are you okay? How's your family? And then trying to piece in like, hey, you got a couple of assignments that are overdue or stuff like that. Not only are you cared for as a student, but you're also cared for as a person, and it makes you feel like you matter. So again, this is one student's quotes, but this was a theme throughout that they want to feel like they are human first, and then, academic students. And so this actually reminded me, there is a really good book that we've had an opportunity to engage with. I recommend it if you don't have it, but it's called The Teacher 50. And basically it works through 50 questions that teachers should constantly be asking themselves on a daily basis. And this one really has always been my favorite. So when we're in the classrooms working with kids, to constantly remind ourselves, are we teaching math or whatever subject it is we're teaching, or are we teaching Matthew? And the answer, of course, students tell us over and over again that they don't care about what we're teaching them content-wise until they know that we care about them as a human being. And again, that's especially true with our students who come to school with trauma and stories where they need to get that support before they can really work through the academics. So we're going to turn it to you again for a minute. We just want to know, before we get into giving you strategies for identifying these students, how do you as professionals identify those students in your buildings that have stories of trauma? In a couple of rooms I visited, a lot of sharing of different strategies. That's awesome to hear. So we're going to get into some more of the meatier stuff. So where and how do we plug in student voice? It's interesting because oftentimes when I talk about student voice, people see it as one more thing they have to do. We are so lucky to be in a district where we are just so rich with resources and we have so many amazing initiatives going on. And so we're so good at social emotional learning. And then we have so many equity things going on. And then we have, 21st century, and the list goes on and on, right? There's so many different things. So when I talk about student voice, I always want to remind people this is not something that you necessarily have to do in addition to anything. Yes, there are really cool student voice activities that can be in addition to everything we're already doing. However, in the classroom, there's a lot that you can do to embed student voice right into your practices. And so when I talk about student voice, I like to look at it from a perspective of where it's a mind shift. And so it's really thinking about our students not as passive, recipients of education, but instead we're really looking at them as partners and change makers and stakeholders in that educational journey. And the more we value that student voice, the more we're going to really include them as experts of themselves and also leaders of their own learning experiences. Obviously, it's really important with students that come from traumatic experiences. Their stories are their stories, and they are the experts on those stories. One of the things that came up yesterday is that student stories of trauma aren't equal. So, one student might be experiencing a trauma that looks similar to another student's trauma, but they perceive it differently, that it manifests itself differently. And so every student really has such a unique and individual story. And so again, we can do things where we're getting at those stories on a constant basis, and it's built right into the structures that we already have going. So one of the ways that it makes it a little more easier to think about infusing student voice throughout our current systems, I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are very familiar with this triangle. It's our MTSS system, right? So thinking about our tier 1 supports that all students get, working right up to those very intense supports that we have to offer for some of our kiddos. Through that, we use our Plan, Do, Study Act. So again, all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle. We are continually going through this on a daily basis. So I know it sounds pretty complicated, and sometimes it can be, but I also like to remind you that as teachers, we're doing this daily, and sometimes you don't even realize it. So for example, you could be planning, or you could be teaching a lesson, and just assessing your room, you could notice these students are really bored, they're not engaged. Shoot, I have to redo something. I have to change something right now. So on the fly, you might change something, and then you're reassessing them, right? And deciding, yeah, okay, this is working, this is better. I'm going to stick with this for now. Maybe I'm going to throw that lesson out. And so we're constantly doing this over and over again every single day. Yesterday, again, our keynote, or Monday, our keynote speaker talked about collective efficacy. And so really getting students together as stakeholders. She talked a lot about getting stakeholders together with that shared vision and making sure stakeholders are diverse. And so when I think about stakeholders in our school systems, who would be the biggest stakeholders? And again, we're not in a classroom setting where you can all tell me, but obviously that's our students. Our students are our biggest stakeholders. So when we think about these problems that we solve on a daily basis, the more we can infuse student voice right into that process, the better. So I have a series of questions that I've just thrown up here, an additional layer of student voice to this whole model, where we're really thinking about whose goals, whose problems are they initially that we're solving, whose goals are, how have the goals been identified? So often we're doing things to or for students, right? And so we know students are struggling with things. And so as adults, we step in and we work through these problems to solve them, and we come up with the plans, but there are goals. And so they're not goals that necessarily belong to students. They're not goals that are relevant. They're not goals that the students are invested in. So thinking about that, how are we engaging them in implementing the plan? So as we implement the plan, are they assessing themselves? Are they collecting their own data? How invested are they in that process, so that when we go to study those results, they're a collaborative member of that process as well. They're sharing some data. They're helping us analyze the data. And then again, is their shared ownership. So the students are at the forefront of deciding with adults, that worked, let's keep going, or that didn't work, we need to change something, or just abandon it altogether and try something else. So this is kind of how we structure the rest of our time together today, is thinking about embedding student voice into this process. All right. And again, the more we do that, the more we're going to have all 5 of those student voice elements present at the table for that. So talking about how we begin to do that. We know that Tier 1 student voice strategies make environments safe and supportive for students affected by trauma. And again, if you revisit that continuum of student voice and focus on those expression and consultation opportunities, we know that the more you build those into your classroom culture on a daily basis, the more students affected by trauma are really going to be comfortable sharing their stories, or letting you know how this is affecting their education. Students often talk about how teachers make assumptions. We're human, and so we do this not just to our students, but I think we do this to our significant others. We do this to our own personal children. We do this, to strangers in the grocery store. So we're constantly making assumptions about people without actually hearing their stories. And students continue to say we do this to them on a daily basis. And so here are some things students have felt like teachers were assuming about them without asking them. So they feel sometimes like we assume they don't care. We assume that they don't try hard enough. We assume they make bad choices. We assume oftentimes that their families don't care. We're assuming they're not applying themselves their full potential. We're assuming they just had a bad day or that they didn't pay attention. And this list goes on and on, right? Because again, we're human and we're doing this. So our keynote speaker said something that I thought was interesting. In the book, she talks about moving from what's wrong with the student, which again, these assumptions are kind of based on that we're teachers and we know there's a problem, so we get in there and it's what's wrong with this kid? How can we fix the kid? So another student quote. So this was one of their hashtags. Hear the truth. So again, students are screaming out like, I want you to know the truth about my stories. And so the more, again, going back to that consultation and expression, the more you can embed that into your classroom practices. We want to get to a point where you're going to students instead and saying, tell me about something. Help me to understand more about this. Tell me what you need in order to be successful with whatever it is that you need them to do. And most importantly, we need them to know that we care. Another hashtag from students, ask us how we are. So again, they're begging for those constant opportunities to tell you how they're doing. So again, how do we do this? So there are a number of ways. This list can go on and on, but I chose some of the ways that I've seen teachers in Washoe County School District implementing Tier 1 strategies that are really effective at soliciting this constant student voice in the classroom. And through these practices, we're really going to be able to identify those kiddos in our classrooms who have stories of trauma. So basically there's two slides. The first one are practices that have been embedded into classroom practices. So these are not things you're doing in addition to, these are things you're tying in with the lessons you're already teaching or the routines that you're already doing in your classroom. And then there's another list that are actually add-on activities and project examples that we've seen. So what we've done is create a list of these resources that Jennifer is putting out through the chat box. So if you want to go ahead and download that. And what we're going to do, we're not going to get into breakout rooms for this, but we wanted to give each of you an opportunity to look through some of these strategies and choose one that either you've already done or one that you want that just jumps out at you, something you want to try. Read the examples given. And then after a few minutes, we're going to come back and ask for a few brave souls to share either verbally or in the chat box which strategies you focused on. Keep in mind, again, I've done a 2-hour training where we dive deeper into every one of these strategies and come up with plans to embed these in your classroom practices. That's why we're just choosing one today, and there's always opportunity to dive deeper if you want to reach out to me at a later time. So again, download the document, choose one strategy that you're already doing or something that you would like to do. Read more about it. You may turn videos off if you would like. We're going to take about 3 minutes to give you that time, and then we'll come back together. That stood out.
I have actually used the cross the line activity a lot. I like to combine guidance and PE and in my elementary school, and that's a good activity to get people outside and moving and thinking, and you can address some kind of topics in a non-threatening, participate if you want kind of a way. And I've also used class meetings a lot. Everybody runs them differently, and as long as it's consistent, those are a really good way to get shy kids especially, to open up. So those are two that I've used.
Awesome.
And they seem to be pretty non-judgmental, and the kids seem to be, it's kind of voluntary. So
yeah. Awesome. Anyone else?
I've used I Wish My Teacher Knew. That's really powerful and eye-opening, and I've never asked them to do it anonymously, so that was kind of an interesting point on that. I've always asked them to please write their name so I can address, especially if it's an individual concern. So I think that one is one of the most powerful for sure.
Yeah, awesome. That I know that went viral, on a national level, and there's been so many variations of that at this point, and it can be so powerful, not just as a one-time approach, but again, systematically as an ongoing approach to student voice. So thank you for sharing your experience with that. Chat box, Tierney saying she's used surveys. There's so many different ways we can use surveys with students. Thank you for sharing. More class meetings. Awesome. It's awesome to see a lot of these strategies are already being used. And again, you'll have access to that list. The list isn't exhaustive, so we also love when people check back in with us. So as you use more of these strategies, if you want to share, we can keep adding to this list of examples. Because, teacher, we always love to hear real life examples from others. So awesome. You like the idea of doing jars at centers to get student feedback anonymously about instruction. Yeah, that was a really interesting approach where the teacher was problem solving some behavior issues. And so letting kids tell you how they're engaging in the material or not, if they're enjoying the material or the lessons. It's awesome. Thank you. All right. We're going to move on. And again, that could be a whole training in and of itself. One of the things when I do these trainings, a lot of times with teachers, one of the things I hear, so if you're a principal here today, or if you're someone who does trainings with teachers, you may have also heard this, but teachers oftentimes will tell me that they're really fearful of using a lot of these strategies because they don't know what to do or how to respond once they do these activities and students share their stories of trauma. I know a lot of us went to school, for education and didn't always get class training on we were taught how to teach students content, not necessarily that counseling piece of things. And so it's really scary at first for a lot of professionals to do this, right? Because if we don't know about student trauma, then it's as a safe place to be. It's a comfort zone, right? And so we want to push them out of that. But it's really important that we acknowledge how difficult that can be sometimes and stop to acknowledge that fear. So here is some of the stuff I talk about when we're talking about, just that. So you've thrown out an I wish my teacher knew activity and a student shares a really traumatic thing. So what do you do with that? And so again, a lot of this came from my experience too, and just hard lessons I've learned over the years, as well as stuff in the research. But one of the things I used to always do in our program and train my staff to do is partnership agreements. And so this can be verbal. It doesn't necessarily have to be a long drawn out thing, but always approach students through partnership agreements. What is it that you need or want from me? And what is it that I need or want from you? And so the crucial question there is asking the students what they expect from you. I actually saw a teacher do this where at the beginning of the school year, the teacher would tell the students about this really supportive environment that they were trying to create for the students and ask the students, in order to do this, what do you need from me? What is it going to take to get there? And so the students, brought up a lot of things. One of the things we consistently hear from students, in fact, it just came up a lot at town halls, is confidentiality. And so students actually said to us at town halls that they don't go to counselors often, or they won't go to a school professional and share their stories of trauma because they tell everybody. And so there's this perception from students that as adults, we sit in meetings and we talk about them. And in all fairness, it's true, right? Because that's our job. We go to PLCs. We constantly have meetings in the staff lounge. We're talking about, oh my gosh, I'm struggling with this kiddo. What do I do? And so they're right. We're having conversations all day about them, but without their knowledge. And so the more you can make it clear to them when you can and can't keep the confidentiality, when you can and can't be available to them, all of those lines of communication, the more you can do that up front, the more it's going to relieve that pressure from you as a professional. Teachers often think once they know about a trauma, they have to solve it all. And so it's not actually the case. There are times that, yes, we have to get further help, but you as a teacher are not expected to solve all the problems for them. So it's important to have those lines of communication open. I'm not sure if any of you have had the opportunity to go through any Love and Logic training, but I did. And one of the best things I took from that was this line that I stole and plugged into every interaction that was difficult and challenging that I had with students. And so prefacing everything with I care about you too much too. And so times when that confidentiality did have to be breached, in my in my line of work for 8 years, I made many calls to CPS. I oftentimes had to go to a principal or a counselor and share things. And so I preface that with, I care about you too much to not share this information, because I have a duty and obligation, to love and care for you. And part of that is getting help. So I loved that strategy, and feel free to share that, steal it and share it everywhere. Again, we learn all the time about how students impacted by trauma. Trust is huge. So one of the things I learned loud and clear from students working in that program is that when they enter our buildings, oftentimes their experiences with authority figures have not been positive. And so we are by default someone that they have learned to not trust. We're a threat to them. And so it can be very difficult to build that trust. And through that, we have to be human. And so one of the most important lessons I also learned through this, when I first came into the field, I really tried hard to keep my own stories out of the classroom, right? Because it was all about them. So they would want to know about me, but I would constantly tell them, like, this is about you. You're the student. I'm here to serve you. Tell me more about you. And one day, a student finally called me out in front of the group and said, Miss Hammond, why would we share our lives with you if you won't share yours with us? And so this was a good reminder. It's okay to be human with the kids. I would often tell them about my bad days. We got to a point where they'd pick up on some of my energy sometimes and say, are you okay today? And sometimes I would tell them, you know what? No, I'm really not okay. This is what's happening, in a nutshell, and let them support you. So it really builds that supportive relationship. And again, gives them a context for a healthy relationship that they don't often have, going on sometimes at home. On a more simple level, when responding to those stories, there's a few things. And so Jennifer is actually going to push out a document right now that goes through this in a way where you can almost work through this as a script. So if you're out doing trainings with professionals, teachers, or if you are one yourself and you're like, man, I'm just so nervous about finding out a student's story of trauma. This is a good place to practice and almost write up a script of how you might respond to a student. And so first and foremost, we want to thank them for sharing. It's very difficult. Obviously, I'm sure a lot of you have had to share, your own stories of difficulties in life with people. It's very scary to these students. And so just thank them for sharing, acknowledge how hard it is, and then validate. This is such a step, I think, that we, not just with students, but in our personal lives as well, with our significant others. I still catch myself doing it with my own children. We want to jump and we want to solve problems, but we don't stop to validate. And so it's super important when students are sharing really heavy things with us that we do stop to let them know, hey, yeah, this sounds really terrible. Oftentimes too, we want to put a positive spin on it and tell them, oh, you know what, but on a positive note, or look at the bright side. And again, that's not always, sometimes that breaks down that line of communication. These kiddos actually want to hear, like, yeah, I'm valid in feeling that what I'm going through is really, really, really difficult. Another way to prevent ourselves from jumping to solutions and solving all their problems for them, and instead doing it with them, is to ask clarifying or follow-up questions. So here's some examples of what that might sound like in the conversation. So again, when we're talking about student voice, our goal is always to learn from the student, right? So again, as teachers, we're like, let me solve this for you. But pause, learn from that student, make sure that what you're hearing is actually what they're trying to tell you, that you're not misinterpreting. And then another thing that people often don't think about, again, it's okay to stop and ask the student what they're wanting from you. And so oftentimes if we ask the student, hey, are you looking for me to like solve a problem for you right now? Or do you just want me to, listen to you right now and know that you care? And again, in our personal lives, think about how many times you've shared something with somebody. And you're just like, oh, I wish you'd just listen. I didn't actually want you to solve that problem for me or tell me how to, fix it. So it's okay to pause and ask them, because again, the goal is to move away from doing things to or for students and doing it with students. Last but not least, it's important that they know that you're kind of closing that feedback loop. And so you've done something in response to their voice. It can actually be pretty harmful if students do share their voice and their significant stories of trauma with you and they feel like you didn't do anything. And so here's a couple of examples of times that students, responded to activities. And this was actually in response to I Wish My Teacher Knew. And so at one school, a bunch of the teachers did the I Wish My Teacher Knew, kind of asked students what they needed from them. And one student actually said, or maybe some teachers kind of read it and then throw it away after. So again, really well-intentioned. A teacher did one of these activities with good intentions. I'm assuming it got busy because that's what happens in our days, and there were other fires to put out, and so nothing actually ever happened with that chart of I wish my teacher knew feedback. And so the students actually felt like it was just a waste of their time. By contrast, we had one student in a different classroom say, we did that activity. The teacher laminated that paper, which that in and of itself made them feel like their voice that they shared was super important. But then they also took that to teachers at a staff meeting at a larger level to really share with other teachers throughout the building of what the students in their school were going through. And through that, they came back and shared with the students that, you know, teachers were shocked by some of what students wrote. And so students felt so impactful. They knew that their voice was heard and that it was being responded to and making a difference in that improvement process. So again, it's important that you close that feedback loop and let them know that you've responded. Okay, a few more things, and we're going to get you back into some breakout rooms. I know that was a lot of information. So a lot of this that we've been talking about are a lot of really good tier 1 strategies. We're identifying students with traumas so that we at least know about them. We know we're always going to have those students who need some very intensive supports. We've got to move into our tier 2 and tier 3 supports. And so again, going back to that plan, do, study, act cycle of improvement. I also, for a while, had a role in the district where I was serving as an implementation specialist or a behavior coach. So I basically went in and I was helping teachers and schools with tier 3 behavior plans. And what was interesting to me is we're doing a lot of amazing things. We're so strong with MTSS. We're so strong with, you know, PLCs. We've been doing amazing work. But it was surprising to me that in the process of these tier 3 intervention plans, we still had this model of the team of educators meeting together to go through all of these cycles, right? So the team of educators produce the objectives, the goals, the plan. They basically present the plan to the students and the families and collect the data and then reevaluate as a team of adults, right? Is this resonating with a lot of you? We do this all the time. And again, really well-intentioned. We've got to keep doing some of this. However, the more that we can again work toward this model of including students at every step of that process, the better. And my career started actually in early childhood, so I can attest that this works all the way from a pre-K level up to high school, and honestly with us adults too. I mean, I'd want to be included in some of my own improvement plans if I was, you know, having to improve something at work. So across the board, the more we can get them involved in that. And I have tons of examples of that and times it's worked, but I want to get you all into groups again to work through this on your own. So that was a lot of information. So again, we're going to get into groups this time and give you a larger chunk of time. We want you to take one of these current district challenges. So through the data that we're seeing this school year right now in the middle of a global pandemic that has put a lot of students in places where they're experiencing trauma, whether that be the big traumas we think about, or the book talks about how even chronic stress and that chronic stress students take on every day, that in itself can be trauma. So a lot of students dealing with a lot of trauma right now. And these are a few things that we're really struggling with district-wide. I'm not sure that any school is exempt from some of these struggles right now. So in your groups, we just want you to choose one of these issues. So either course failure rates, chronic absenteeism rates, or low levels of student engagement. I know so far that number 3, the levels of engagement, has been a big one with groups in this session. So choose one, and using all of that information you just received, how might you face this challenge, including that student voice as part of the Plan, Do, Study, Act process? Back, everyone. So we're almost finished. I did want to give opportunity for a group or maybe 2 to share a little bit about what they discussed, especially in regards to student trauma and how student trauma might be a factor in some of these and what you do about that and trying to solve these problems. So we have a brave group who might want to share some insights.
I'll share for our group because I love our idea that we came up with. So in our group, we talked about having sort of a leadership committee of students in every school throughout the year, but have it be sort of rotating every quarter. So it's not always the, the star students that are selected for leadership, but we're giving lots of kids an opportunity to have a role and have a voice in their school. So that was our idea that we came up with.
Awesome. I love that too. And again, it is so important when we're trying to solve these problems that we have, diverse student perspectives at the table. And so that's something we constantly talk about with student voice. Any of the work we're doing, we want to make sure, if we're solving chronic absenteeism, we don't want to just go to the students who have really good attendance. So I know in the past, I did a big project around attendance and chronic absenteeism. And I was very strategic in pulling students into that committee who had really good attendance, who had kind of, struggling attendance, but not too bad. And then some of those students who were just so chronically absent. And so I definitely wanted those diverse perspectives. So thank you for sharing that. So I want to remind everybody once again that we are here. There's tons of resources around all of these topics. I'm always happy to come in and talk more about any of these things, whether it's classroom strategies for individual teachers, or at the school level, kind of guiding some of those large school student voice projects. So last but not least, I wanted to revisit some of our objectives for the night. So I know it's late, but this is actually my favorite part of the whole night. So here are what we were hoping you would know after tonight and what we were hoping you would feel. And so if you could open the chat box and choose one or the other. So I'm not asking you to do both unless you want to, but if you could just either share one strategy that you took from tonight that you really want to either revisit or something new that you want to implement as far as soliciting student voice and those stories of trauma and responding to them, or finish a sentence stem, I am feeling. So tell us about how you are feeling as a result of this short little time that we got to have together. Awesome. I love reading the ones that you're feeling inspired to try new things, feeling some empathy for trauma impacted students, curious about student stories, such an important one to always be curious, feeling encouraged that student voice has a place in our district. Awesome. We are very lucky for that. We're probably leading the force with a few other districts in some of the student voice work. So more confident in responding to student trauma. Good. I actually said more confident instead of just confident, because I don't know that we're ever going to be fully confident. Those stories of trauma are always going to be really heavy and really difficult to hear, no matter how confident we get at it. So hopeful with using the strategies. Awesome. More empathy for our students impacted by trauma. That's awesome. So someone said, I'm doing these things and didn't know. I love that. In fact, for years working in that program, I did all of these things unknowing that I didn't know that it was actually called something. So when I started hearing about student voice, I was like, oh yeah, this is validating that I'm doing something right. So a lot of you are doing this stuff and don't know it. And again, the more we can be very strategic and systematic about it, the more it's going to make our lives easier and also get those student stories and build that culture of student voice. Awesome. More confidence, validated for the work we're doing. Very important. I'm glad. More confident to seek and listen to student stories. All right. Well, that's awesome to hear. Thank you for engaging in that as well. Again, there's tons of more resources. I've said it a million times, but reach out to us if you want to go deeper into anything that you learned tonight or have more discussion. Any questions about it? I know in an hour and 15 minutes, we didn't leave time for questions, but my email is always, you can email me anytime. It's just mhammond@washoeschools.net. We're happy to answer any questions and come do some more work with students.